Hello and welcome to my channel. This is going to be another episode of Your Perfect Palette, which is an ongoing series that I have been working on, talking about various colors around the color wheel based upon a split primary palette and the colors that I choose for my palette. And hopefully in doing so, you're going to pick up some tips, some thoughts of mine that might help you either say, I'm happy with what I've got in mind, or I'm not quite sure what to put in my palette. So a little bit of insight into that thought process could be handy. And today we're going to expand on the other videos in the series and talk about dark neutrals. Dark neutrals for me they are pretty indispensable. When I'm talking about dark neutrals, I'm talking about colors in towards the center of an artist's color wheel. So your grays, your various hues of gray, or mouse grays, as I've heard them referred to before in Making Color Sing by Gene Dobie. So let's take a quick look at a graphic here. So while I have spoken about colors around the outside of the wheel, I'm going to be speaking more about colors towards the inside of the color wheel. So in the center there where we have kind of black and then the dull shades, hues around the outside of that. So let's take a look at this graphic here. Well, this tool really is what it is. It's a great tool made by Daniel Smith. It does speak primarily to the Daniel Smith pigments. Well, primarily it speaks to the Daniel Smith pigments, which makes sense. But nevertheless, regardless of whatever paints you use, you'll find some similarities. And it's the CIE Lab color map, which, as you can see, has, I don't know if it's all of their pigments. They have a lot, well over 250 different pigments available. But there's a lot of them, and I just haven't taken the time to go through and count all the little squares. Once upon a time, I probably would have done that, but not anymore. Nevertheless, you can see that they go around, as one would expect, in a color wheel format, going from kind of your middle yellows to your warmer yellows, oranges, reds, into your cooler reds, violets, and then to our kind of blue violets to blues, cool blues, greens, kind of cooler greens, into our warmer greens, back around to our yellows. And I do have a number of videos that I've already put up speaking about yellows and reds, blues. I've also done one on earth yellows, kind of range in here, earth oranges, this kind of range in here. And just recently I put one up on greens, which I thought was a pretty interesting video. Of course, my opinion, maybe slightly biased. Nevertheless, what we want to talk about today, or what I want to talk about, is this kind of area in the middle here, where we have all these grays. Now, Daniel Smith, again, does have an awful lot of options when it comes to gray. And I'm not going to get into all of them. I'm really going to kind of stick to the big ones, pose, and a few ancillary pigments that do serve as kind of quasi-neutrals, depending on your tastes. And again, the goal of this video, as I'm going through these, I'll be talking about the ones that I use, why I choose the pigments that I choose for my palette, but I will talk about some other ones that I have some experience with and have used in the past. And, sometimes I miss them, sometimes I don't. So we're going to be looking all in this area here. So we're going to be talking about things like lamp black. Where we got here? Not that one. Neutral tint and Payne's gray. Those are kind of some big ones. But we're also going to talk about alternate ones like perylene green and here indigo, a few others. So a dark neutral really is just that. It's not a high chroma pigment. If you don't have a dark neutral in your palette, you can mix neutrals using your complements. So if you have like burnt sienna and ultramarine is a pretty traditional pairing. They will, in the right mix, they will neutralize to gray, ideally, or ultramarine with burnt umber, or reds and greens in a thick consistency can mix to blacks, which can then be thinned out to grays. And depending on how you weight it, it could be a slightly reddish gray or slightly greenish gray. And same with ultramarine burnt sienna. You can use more burnt sienna to warm it up, or you can use more blue to cool it down. So that is a method to make neutrals that should be practiced, should be learned. However, having said that, having a pre-mixed neutral in the palette, and you'll see what I mean by mixed, with the exception of something like lamp black, which is single pigment. Most of these mixtures are convenience mixtures, and they're a gray, a ready to go gray, or in thick consistency, almost a black, that you can use to dull down high chroma paints. Now, seeing as I tend to gravitate towards higher chroma paints for my primaries and even for secondaries as well, it is nice to have a dark neutral so that I can quickly tone those down. I don't always want bright colors. Now, with have an orange, I could use an earth orange, which is going to be naturally duller, but I might want something even duller, right? Like an earth orange is going to be somewhere around here. But what about down in this area? You can use a dark neutral with earth orange to dull that down. So let's take a look at some paints. I think I already have them set up in here. This up, this in, and here we go. We've got a whole bunch. Now, the first thing that you should note with all the paints that we look at on the Daniel Smith website here, especially when you add them into this list, we have all the pigments that are involved in making these, as I said, convenience mixtures. Now, when I say convenience mixture, I'm referring to a tube of paint that doesn't have just a single pigment in it, with the exception of the lamp black, which has a single pigment, and the perylene green, which has a single pigment. You can see that all of these other ones are all mixtures. So, it's not just the painters with the complements that are using a mixture to make a gray. When they put them in these convenient tubes, these convenient mixtures in the tubes, they are doing the same thing. They're just kind of doing it for you. And I think these are great because once you kind of understand what the color or hue or the overall nature of your neutral is, whether it leans cool or warm, then you can actually start to manipulate that as well. So you don't need, a neutral tint and a Payne's gray or a Payne's blue gray. You just need one. You just kind of need to know where it lies, where it leans, and then you can adjust that, right? So for example, if you look at neutral tint here, it is much warmer compared to the Payne's blue gray. Now, if I had Payne's blue gray in my palette and I wanted to, make it more like neutral tint, I would need to warm it up a little with a little bit of burnt sienna, even use a tiny little bit of red in there, whatever you wanted to kind of warm it up. And then same with the neutral tint. If I wanted to cool it down, I could add a little bit more blue into it to cool it down. So perhaps some ultramarine would be something that could be used to cool down a neutral tint. And as you can see down here when we look at the pigments, so I won't talk too much about these here because we have pigment blue. I believe this is phthalo blue. This is pigment violet 19. This is either a quinacridone rose or a beta quinacridone. I'm pretty sure it's quinacridone rose. And then we have the PBK6. So PBK6 is the one I will speak about quickly. It is lamp black. Lamp black is a very light, fast, very opaque, heavily staining black pigment. It is typically the darkest valued, most opaque black, and as a result, it can show a pretty significant drying shift as your washes dry out. So you really need to watch your consistencies if you're using something like neutral tint to create a very dark blackish passage, because used in a light wash, it will lighten up quite a bit, and that's not always a bad thing. So neutral tint is, you'll find it in a lot of painters' palette. It's just very versatile. It's designed to be, I don't know, non-confrontational, I suppose, is what I'm going to say. You can take a little bit of neutral tint into pretty much any color, like a medium, a Hansa yellow medium, and you can dull that down and almost get sort of ochre type looks to it. You can add neutral tint to really any of the brighter colors and dull them down, bring them in from the outside of the color wheel, from the high chroma, and taking that chroma down. Now you can see, great to have these things laid out side by each. As you can see, as we move towards Payne's Gray is a little more neutral. Next to the kind of warmth of the neutral tint comparatively, it almost feels a little greenish, but it isn't. It's actually pigment blue 29, which is ultramarine, and then we have the pigment black 9. So this one's not the PBK6. Pigment black 9 is ivory black, and it is a very light, fast. It's semi-transparent and staining, well, low staining, as they say for the overall paint here for the Payne's Gray. But it is a slightly less intense, warmer alternative to lamp black. Lamp black being over here. You can see the difference between these two, where the PBK has added, it's kind of not as dark, so not as in. Now, with the Payne's Gray, which was a paint that I had used before, but I've also used Payne's Grays by other makers. And Payne's Gray is one of those paints, like a sap green or a hooker's green, where there really is no kind of line in the sand. Is that you don't cross this. They all need to line up, and they should all be the same. There's a lot of variation between the different paint makers in what their hooker's greens look like and what their sap greens look like. Sap green is generally warmer and slightly duller, and hooker's green is generally towards the blue and slightly higher in chroma. But Payne's Grays tend to vary quite a bit. So I think the difference between Payne's Gray by Daniel Smith and, say, Payne's Gray by Winsor & Newton is the Payne's Gray by Winsor & Newton is a lot more blue to my eyes. So I'm not sure if that's why or why not, but within the last number of years, Daniel Smith introduced Payne's Blue Gray. Now this does look a lot more like Payne's Gray by Winsor & Newton to my eyes. And then it uses a different blue in there, PB60, and then it's using the less warm pigment black 6. So it's using the lamp black. So with the combination of those different pigments to the two that are in the Payne's Gray, we do get a different result. Now, which one's best? They're really, any one of these you can use. You just need to know what its nature is. And then once you know that, then if you want a particular, adjustment, then you know that you can adjust it. If I know Payne's Blue Gray is cooler and I want something warmer, then I need to add something into this. If I want Payne's Gray to be cooler, then I can adjust that by adding a little bit of blue, just like I mentioned a little bit ago. Hopefully that makes some sense. Now we'll move over to another neutral here, and is lamp black, and then there's another one that I don't have in this list. But lamp black was a paint that I didn't really see the need for at one point, but it is in my palette and has been in my palette for quite some time. And seeing as I do paint a large number of birds, I tend to use it when I paint the pupils, because while I can take the neutral tint and use it quite thick, and it does appear black in the overall painting with respect to the other value placements in the painting, lamp black is it feels just a lot darker when I use it nice and thick, and I generally want that pupil to be the blackest part of my painting. So I do keep it in there for that, but it is also pretty versatile too, because it does lighten so much. As I mentioned when talking about the pigment, you can use it as a fairly neutral gray too. It is more opaque than I would prefer, but that said, in a pinch, you can use a little bit of lamp black in some of your other pigments to tone them down pretty quick. So it is fairly versatile. If I had to choose, if I only had like one space and it had to be lamp black or neutral tint, I would go with the neutral tint personally. But because I have an extra spot, I do actually keep both of these in my palette, both the neutral tint and the lamp black. Now we're going to move over to some alternate choices for neutrals. And I have used all four of these and have found them very useful. I don't have three of these in my palette right now, but indigo tends to, this swatch here doesn't really do it justice. It's a little bit more blue than this. Oddly enough, they list the exact same pigments for indigo as they do for blue-gray. It's just got a lot more pigment black in there. And then Van Dyke Brown, this is a really useful neutral because it is a lot warmer than the other neutrals. But that said, I can take, a burnt sienna with a good bit of neutral tint in it, and I can bring that right down. Or I can take burnt sienna with a little bit of lamp black in there, and I can bring that down as well. And I can get a hue very similar to the Van Dyke Brown. And the difference being the Van Dyke Brown is a granulating pigment, and then using the lamp black and the neutral tint, I can actually forego the granulation because they're both non-granulating, or lamp black or the neutral tint. So, and as I have mentioned in previous videos, I tend to prefer paints that are a little less granulating. Some of them you can't avoid it, like primarily blues, the exception of the phthalos, but most of the other blues tend to have a little bit of granulation, some of it a bit more pronounced with something like a cerulean. Now, sepia, it's another dark neutral. It is a lot warmer. This is would be a fringe inclusion in dark neutrals. But then again, sepia, if you look at it with respect to the colors here, close this for a moment. Now, sepia sits in here, and then we have our burnt siennas and other earth oranges in this area. I can bring these in by using, a dark neutral like neutral tint or a lamp black, and I can actually create a sepia-like hue. So, do you need it in your palette? Not necessarily. Is it handy? Yes, it certainly can be. Um, I have sepia in my palette right now, and I will actually use sepia and a little bit of my earth orange, which is burnt sienna light, and I get a burnt umber kind of look. And then I have some versatility with the sepia to kind of go towards a Van Dyke brown with a little bit of lamp black in it. So I do have some play with that. And then the last one on my list here is, I can't think of any other paint that I miss having in my palette more at this time of year than Perylene Green. Now, it's called Perylene Green. The pigment in it is Pigment Black 31. It's called Perylene Black is the name of the pigment. And it's very light fast, it's semi-transparent, and it's fairly staining. And it's very dark valued, but it has a yellow-green hue to it. So this is just lovely for dark shadows and forests and things like that. And you can put a little bit of, a cool red into it, like Quin Rose or something like that, and really take this, to your dark blacks as well. So it can be pretty versatile. I don't have it in my palette now, but I do really like it. And there are times when, I think I see a well getting a little low, and I'm like, the time to put this back in. And I haven't. I haven't used it in a few years, but I do have a fondness for this. So there are a whole bunch of pigments, and there are a lot more, as you can see from the graphic that I showed earlier. But as far as dark neutrals go, and almost into blacks as well, the main ones for me are neutral tint and lamp black. Neutral tint, if I could only pick one. Lamp black, because I have the space. And then I do keep a sepia in my palette. And with it and my neutrals and my earth colors, I can get burnt umber type hues, and I can get Van Dyke brown type hues as well pretty quickly. So, and it's just a question of getting used to what the result is going to be. And yes, I am aware that it does list sepia as a granulating pigment, but as you can see in the swatch here, this is pretty accurate as far as the granulation you see there. It's not really granulating. It's kind of low granulating. So there are my thoughts on dark neutrals. So hopefully you found this helpful. And if you didn't, well, I did it anyways. And if you've been enjoying this series and you enjoy this video, please do give it a like. And if you have any questions or comments, do so below. And until next time, happy painting. Bye for now.